Today's instalment, I'm delighted to welcome back Aidan Mattis from the Law Lodge podcast to shed some light on the hobbies and interests of our medieval friends. Aidan, how's it going today?
Oh, good. I'm gonna have some fun with this one.
Oh yeah, because I think it's quite interesting because we obviously when we read a lot of fantasy, I spoke about it in previous episodes. We People tend to get bogged down in the sort of grander things, don't they? The
Mhm. Yeah.
the dragons, the chosen one themes, magic systems, and all that. And what makes us human and what makes characters alive and worlds feel alive are the little details, I think, that tell the reader or show the reader that people actually have lives beyond the story.
Mhm.
And one way that I've found a lot of success in, I particularly enjoy this side of world building, is what they enjoy doing actually with their free time. So
Mhm.
I wanted to ask you about this today. Like, what the medieval people like to get up to when they weren't tilling in the fields and doing all that jazz?
Sure. So it definitely varies by sort of where you were in the social structure. As I said in one of the earlier episodes, you had three main social classes, and those were the laborators, the orators, and the delators. And if you don't trust me with that classification, I got that from Dr. Benjamin Hudson. He's a Oxford PhD. You can go research his work. I'm not pulling this out of my ass. If you were in the orators class, the monks and the priests, what you were doing in your free time, especially as a monk, was probably going to be first of all very dependent on what rule you observed. Benedictine, Franciscan, Dominican, Carthusian. Some were more severe and some were more leisurely. It really depended. But if you were in one of the uh, rules that was more open to allowing leisure and conversation, you had the things like the Kennebitic monks, things like that, which of course I believe is where Obi-Wan Kenobi comes from in Star Wars. I think he was thinking Kennebitic. I might be wrong, but I like to think he was having a nudge there because the Jedi were warrior monks. But yeah, if you were a clergyman, then your free time, if you were allowed to have enjoyment in your life, which some of them were not. But if you were allowed to enjoy your life, then you would probably spend your time reading, drinking. Monks were often famous for the ale that they created. You also might enjoy some Gregorian chanting, or just a nice hike through nature. That was probably your free time as a monk, what you would be doing to enjoy yourself. If you were a bishop, you had a little bit more leeway. You could actually go to theatrical performances and watch bards do their thing. But the clergy was probably the class that was allowed to have the least fun. If you were in the Bellator class, the warrior class, then you had a lot more access. You would probably be expecting to have feasts, and you could go hunting, traveling even to foreign places. You could go on a pilgrimage, and you had basically, if you could pay for it, you could do it. Now there were certain things that were looked down upon that you were expected to avoid doing, things that would be seen as like what lowly peasants would do, for example. Going to like a local inn and tavern and mingling with the peasant class was frowned upon if you were part of the knightly class. Now, that was not necessarily true in the earlier medieval period. If you were of the warrior class, you would be a little bit more, you'd have some more leeway of what you were allowed to do. But that was very important. Was maintaining your status and your image. As for women in the noble class, what we have a lot of to this day are what are called books of hours, which were essentially devotionals, but they would also have poems and songs and artwork, and it was basically a way for women of the palace to keep up with their religious studies, as well as even to learn history and to practice their reading and writing. These would often be customized to fit the woman they were being made for. They would often be written by monks, and you would just get if you so for to this day, if you find a book of hours from a specific noblewoman, it's going to tell you a lot about her and even maybe about her family and the time she lived. You can tell even from like the colors of dyes that were being used how wealthy she was. But you'll have a lot of illustrations and a lot of some folk tales and epic sagas. You might have the Arthurian material in there, things like that. If you were in France, you might have like the Lay of Melion, something more akin to French tradition, like werewolves and stuff like that. And then if you were a man, you might also have something similar in terms of like a diary or a devotional book. Men would also have access to all sorts of libraries and whatnot. And of course, probably the most popular sporting event for men of the time, if you were in the noble class, was hunting, because that was something the peasants weren't allowed to do. So you would ride out in the woods with some other noblemen and either use bows to go after deer, or you might go boar hunting with a boar spear, things like that. And often the leisurely activities for noblemen involved things that would work as practice for warfare and for combat, because that was you were always training. If you were a knight, no matter what you were doing, you were always training. And of course, you would be able to have private parties and hire troubadours and do feasts on your own. Now, if you were in the laborator class, things were a bit different because there was no keeping up appearances for your class. So those, artisans and farmers and whatnot, those were the people you were going to most likely see in local inns and taverns or at brothels. Another thing that gets way overdone in a lot of fantasy and historical fiction is how much time people spent at brothels. Like, you might go, but people weren't spending every night at the brothel. That wasn't something that A, you could afford, or B, that was even like kind of looked at as like okay. Especially as you got later in the Middle Ages and the Catholic Church's power increased. They frowned upon that kind of thing more and more. But being in a tavern, coming home from a long day in the fields and heading into town to have a drink and meet with the lads and listen to the newest single from whatever troubadour was passing through town, that was something people did. And that was
still to today.
Not too different, honestly. Like we still enjoy many of the same things as our ancestors did. For me on Wednesdays in the town I live in, there's a bar that has karaoke night on Wednesdays, and I go there, I have a drink, I sing some songs. Like, I'm doing the exact same thing my ancestors were doing 1,000 years ago.
Yeah.
Which is fascinating to think about how little has changed in that much time from the things we enjoy, because a tavern is not much different from your average pub these days.
Yeah.
So, you'd have like your traveling musicians, and you go and you listen to them. And if you had an extra coin, you'd toss them a coin. The whole the bardic tradition that gets the troubadour tradition you see in TV shows like The Witcher, very true to life. Troubadours were going to be very flamboyant, bright colors, and just peacocking. They were trying to appear interesting. Being a bard was the kind of thing where you wanted people to know you were the bard. Yeah. So you're going to wear colorful clothing and have a silly hat with feathers and have very wide gestures and speak loudly and all that. You wanted to be the center of attention because you wanted people to see you and be interested in what you had to do and say. You also might see in a lot of fantasy series that you'll have people performing magic. No. I want to make it very clear. Magic, not a thing in the Middle Ages. People did not like magicians. You were a witch. Magic was illegal. It was wrong. The only time you were allowed to perform magic was if you were a court wizard, which meant you had formal training. And even then, that was pretty rare. So performing a simple card trick would probably get you burned at the stake. So you didn't see a lot of magic. Gandalf coming into town and having the fireworks go off and making things disappear and all that would not have played well in the Middle Ages. But for the labor class, outside of going into the inn and maybe going to the brothel or going to listen to somebody play music in the town square, you might something as simple as going for a hike with your friends. You couldn't hunt, but you could go and enjoy nature. People would often pick flowers and make flower arrangements. People would do things like when you make it embroidery or cross stitching or things like that, just to kind of like make decorations. That was common for women. But you were it was a period of time where your leisure activities often in some way related to your job because you were always practicing to be better. But at the same time, people were, you'd get up early, you'd go out in the fields, and you'd probably be done your workday if you were a farmer by 3 or 4 in the afternoon. And then you'd have the rest of the day to relax. And relaxation could just mean hanging out and spending time with your family, or spending time with other farmers. Maybe just having a sparring match with your wooden swords or whatnot to just play night if you were a kid. It's interesting because when you think about it, what do we do in our leisure time as modern people? We listen to music. We go to the bar with our friends. We as kids often do have play sword fights and play pretend and act like we're doing something else, or we'll read. We'll put ourselves into another world. We're doing much the same thing today as our ancestors did 1,500, 1,000, 500 years ago. So when you're writing a fantasy story, obviously you gotta put yourself into the time period.
Yeah.
But at the same time, think about what if you were in that time period, what would you enjoy?
Yeah, exactly.
That's what your character should be doing in their leisure time. You don't need to pretend people were going to enjoy something. You don't need to write it so that like there's some strange habit people have. It doesn't need to be fantastical. Your story is going to feel real if your character comes in from a long day on the road and they have a beer and toss a coin to the troubadour and go upstairs and go to bed. Like that's accurate, and people are going to identify with it.
Something I wanted to ask you about was when I was doing a bit of research for this episode, was wrestling was really popular, particularly amongst the lower classes.
Yes. Wrestling and later boxing, actually. So wrestling has a very ancient tradition to it, going back to, it was a very common sport for the Greeks.
Yeah.
It got kept up with the Romans, and there's an entire, I guess, not genre, but an entire style of wrestling called Greco-Roman wrestling, which is based off of pankration, which is different from modern wrestling. But it was a good way to, to assert your masculinity. It was a good way to entertain people because it's fun to watch a wrestling match and people can place bets. And, if you get good enough at it, you can even go town to town and have that be what you do for a living. The troubadours were not the only people traveling from town to town, at least in terms of minstrels. A troubadour troupe might go from town to town. They might bring a couple of wrestlers with them to put on a spectacle. They might bring somebody who can like stack a cat on top of a dog on top of a goat, stuff like that. You just have these spectacles, and that would be what people enjoyed and what people wanted to see. And of course, there were plays and there were theatrical performances and whatnot that people could go to. And often, that was the kind of thing where the rich would have seats, but there would be standing room for the poor. But yeah, wrestling, very common. And later on, boxing actually came about as a sport because it came out of the dueling tradition. You would have, two people might duel for something, and then as weapons became more and more deadly and duelists became more and more renowned, you wouldn't want exactly to kill each other. Yeah. So you would have people stand in, and instead of dueling with weapons, they would duel with their fists. And eventually it became illegal to duel with weapons. And instead of doing that, people would have boxing matches. So boxing came out of this tradition of dueling, and that's where we ended up with it today. And the stakes could have been just as high then as they are now.
Yeah. What about jousting?
Jousting was primarily a leisure activity for the upper class, but the lower classes would definitely have enjoyed watching. Usually, again, seats would be for the wealthy, and there would be standing room for the poor and for the peasants. But jousting was the kind of thing where you were only allowed to participate if you were of the noble class. You might get away with it because you got to remember that, not every tournament is going to have you prove that you're of noble lineage. Or you could easily forge documents. You could say that you're the son of a count from somewhere far across Europe, and nobody's going to be able to disprove you. But most likely, you're only going to have the training if you're actually part of the noble class. But it was very popular, but also extraordinarily dangerous. And jousting in and of itself was not always the main event. Usually the main event was the melee. where you would have people on foot fighting with blunted weapons. And even though the weapons were blunted, there were times when, very high-ranking nobles would die during these bouts. It's actually been revived today, medieval MMA. And most countries have national teams that most European and Commonwealth countries have national teams that will go and compete. There's a Vice documentary on it from a few years ago where the American team actually ended up beating I think the British team, which is just kind of hilarious because you got the Brits wearing their the traditional the three lions and the traditional English heraldry, and then the Americans were out there in stars and stripes surcoats, just beating people over the head.
Nice.
It's cool because you get to see all these countries wearing the traditional royal arms.
That's really cool.
Yeah, and it's fascinating that things that were developed 1,000 years ago are still things we're enjoying today. It's funny to see the stuff that humans will continue to come back to over and over again, whether it is Greco-Roman wrestling or gladiatorial matches or melees or jousting. And then, you can even, if you look at what we enjoy today in terms of sports, contact sports like rugby and football, where you've got two teams of men just going head to head and beating the snot out of each other, essentially. But, we've kept it going, and there are some distinctly human things that do not change over time, which I think is very interesting.
Yeah.
And you even find it like, one other interesting thing, just really quick, is like handball is a European sport, right?
Yeah.
So soccer and rugby and all these things all have a lot in common with, for example, Mayan and Aztec sports. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but there's one where you had to use your elbows and your knees and your hips to hit a ball through hoops. It's basically like an early form of like basketball or soccer.
Yeah.
It's kind of like Quidditch almost. And the winning team would actually be sacrificed. Different priorities in Mesoamerica than in Europe. But, it's interesting how these similarities develop completely in isolation from one another. Humans are fascinating creatures.
Yeah, especially when we've got a bit of free time on our hands.
Yeah.
Get very creative. Aidan, thanks so much for sharing your wisdom there. It's been so interesting chatting about the kind of things that, people used to get up to. I just haven't changed one bit.
Yeah.
We're just exactly the same. And that's important when you're writing your stories, is just to think about what we do, what we enjoy, what humans enjoy, because humanity hasn't really changed for a long time.
We get up to the same stuff.
Yeah, most definitely. Aidan, how can we find out a bit more about you?
You can find me on TikTok, Instagram, and Snapchat at the Aidan Mattis. That's TheAidanMattis, or on YouTube and Patreon at The Lore Lodge.
Nice one. The links will be in the description too, as always. And yeah, thanks very much, Aidan, and thanks very much for listening.
Thanks for having me.